Welcome, everyone. My name is Bernard Siegel. I'm the Executive Director of the Regenerative Medicine Foundation. The 16th World Stem Cell Summit is a special project of our foundation. The summit has been designed to be the ecosystem event. We seek to bring all the stakeholders together because regenerative medicine and stem cells represent the future of medicine. A new platform, drugs, biologics, medical devices, and now cell therapies, a potentially game-changing technology, an area of biomedical research that not only can treat chronic diseases for which no cure has been found, but also be a curative technology. We've gone through a year of the pandemic, and much of the world is still under the cloud. We've seen how funding and necessity have advanced the field of biomedical research and created vaccines to protect us not only from this pandemic, but perhaps future pandemics as well. It just proves the point. When we work together, we can make things change. This year's summit offers a wide variety of topics and experts, well beyond what's normally been offered at a stem cell meeting. We're dealing with health literacy, diversity, geopolitical issues, vexing policy issues, ethical issues that we've never faced before, all arguably even species-altering events. And we bring together all aspects of our community, from patient advocates, scientists, clinicians, investors, industry representatives, you name it, they're here. And they're here for you to contact and interact with. Our programming extends from the National Football League and the future of contact sports in the world and the treatment of professional athletes and indeed all athletes with the tools of regenerative medicine and stem cells. And this group is an important advocacy arm in moving this field forward, all the way to the science and life sciences and stem cell research that's taking place on the International Space Station and everything in between. We have incredible breakthroughs. Is there anyone in this audience that can imagine that either themselves or their children might live to 150 or longer? Well, there are many scientists that say that this is a possibility, extending the healthy human lifespan. But what are the ethical issues, and what is the longevity agenda in the long run? I want to thank all of those that put together the fabulous Regenerative Medicine Essentials course. That includes my co-chair, Dr. Anthony Atala at the Wake Forest Institute for Regenerative Medicine, the course director, the fabulous Joan Shank, who's put so much time and effort, the team from Wake Forest, and also the team for the Regenerative Medicine Foundation. This meeting even includes an awards ceremony. At the very end of our program on June 18th, I hope all of you will attend. And not only will you hear about the wonderful Action Award honorees, but you'll have some special messages, including from the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the Honorable Nancy Pelosi, Seth Rogen and his wife, Lauren Rogen, Hilarity for Charity, but moreover, stem cell advocates and advocates for Alzheimer's disease, and also even the animated STEMI the Stem Cell. I'm here to help you connect dots. Indeed, with my background in law, I've perhaps picked an unusual career change to be a full-time stem cell advocate about 20 years ago. I believe advocacy can change the world, and I believe everyone that's attending and viewing this World Stem Cell Summit and the Regenerative Medicine Essentials course can change the world. Please reach out to me on the partnering app and if you have any questions about anything, if you need a contact that you feel that will advance your goals, please let us know. It's not only myself, the entire team of the Regenerative Medicine Foundation is at your service. That's what this is about, connecting the dots and changing the world. Now, as we are about to begin our program, I want to reflect on something that influenced me a long time ago. In a bygone era, circa 1972, when I was a senior in college, I read a book that had influence. I'm holding it up, the dog-eared copy of Future Shock by Alvin Toffler. And of course, Future Shock talks about how the future and the onslaught of these new technologies is going to impact society. And if you'll allow me and indulge me a second, I want to read just a tiny portion of this because I think it's thought-provoking as to our next two speakers. Toffler talks about the first 50,000 years of man's existence. And if we divided it into lifetimes of approximately 62 years each, there have been about 800 such lifetimes. Of these 800, fully 650 were spent in caves. Only during the last 70 lifetimes has it been possible to communicate effectively from one lifetime to another, as writing made it possible to do. Only during the last 6 lifetimes did masses of men ever see a printed word. Only during the last 4 has it been possible to measure time with any precision. Only in the last 2 has anyone anywhere used an electric motor. And the overwhelming majority of all material goods we use daily in life today have been developed within the present, the 800th lifetime. And when I think from the time that I was in college to what it's like now in the 21st centuries, I can see the wisdom of Toffler. Now, he goes on to say, now imagine not merely an individual, but an entire society, an entire generation, including its weakest, least intelligent, and most irrational members, suddenly transported into this new world. The result is mass disorientation, future shock on a grand scale. I think, personally, that a lot of the world is suffering from future shock. Because after all, it's not only the industrialized world, it's all of mankind, all of humankind. So in thinking about that and trying to put things in context, I read where a politician recently in the United States made a statement, a public statement. The politician said, I don't believe in evolution. I'm paraphrasing. I don't believe in evolution. I believe in God. Well, when we talk about the profound changes due to the advances in biomedicine and talk about stem cell research and regenerative medicine and the fact that we now have gene editing, and a decade ago when we were talking about the dangers of human reproductive cloning, when that was more of topical interest, we understand that this is just magical to many people and threatening to many people. Our next plenary speakers are Dr. Robin Smith. Robin Smith is very well known and very honored as an advocate for the field of stem cell research. In fact, she received the Regenerative Medicine Foundation's Action Award for diplomacy, the first time we've ever given that award a few years ago. She's a business leader, an entrepreneur, a medical doctor, She co-authored a brilliant book, Cells Are the New Cure, and she's president and chair of the Cura Foundation. The Cura Foundation is the driving force for a meeting that takes place in the Vatican on health and science. I myself, a proponent of embryonic stem cell research, have been invited to speak there with a number of speakers from all walks of life and from all religions and all sects and all beliefs under a common theme. I would suggest a common theme and a common denominator for all of humanity is healing. And indeed, the health conference at the Vatican is a strong effort to unite us in ways that we can unite. So Robin is going to speak first in something we're calling the Cura Corner. And she's going to introduce Dr. Frances Collins, who is the director of the US National Institutes of Health, the NIH. It's been said that the National Institutes of Health is the greatest engine of scientific advancement in the history of humankind. Dr. Collins is a very smart man, talented man, a musician. Also, he's managed to serve in the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration in his lofty job. He participated in the last Vatican meeting this year, and I listened to his talk, and as I listened to it, I found it to be a meditation. It was a personal meditation. It was very meaningful. The topic of faith and science, and can faith and science be reconciled, is just as important an issue today as it has been over the centuries of civilized humanity. So I think to our audience at the World Stem Cell Summit, and understanding the lofty role of Dr. Frances Collins, it serves us well to listen to him, not only to talk about science and faith, but to reflect on this if we're to move the future forward safely, effectively. Robin Smith.
Now please welcome Dr. Robin Smith, President of the Cura Foundation and Vice President of the Vatican Science and Faith Foundation, STOQ.
The past year has affected every single human being in unimaginable ways. All of our lives have changed. The COVID crisis has forced us to close down entire economies, put entire countries on lockdown, stop travel, shut down millions of businesses, and has even affected our children's education in unprecedented ways. And sadly, we've lost over 3 million lives. Yet as devastating as this has been, when we look back on this pandemic, we will see a story of how the world came together to defeat an invisible enemy and avert even greater destruction and loss of more lives. While the battle isn't over yet, it's clear that we will win and be better prepared for what may come in our future. COVID-19 has brought the world together against a common adversary. People in science and medicine, business, government, and philanthropy have all embarked on a mission to save the world. Their response has been extraordinary, historic, and a lesson for the ages. The COVID vaccines were developed in just 1 year, a process that usually takes up to a decade. Lessons learned should help us accelerate the development of cellular medicines and stem cell therapies and bring new excitement to the field of regenerative medicine and novel therapeutics that can repair tissue, restore function, and allow us a healthier longevity. As with any disruptive technology, there's always uncertainty and questions, so it's critical that we control the narrative. And to be effective, we must educate and build networks and create areas for dialogue, like that which is being done at the World Stem Cell Summit. We must look for areas of convergence between humanities and the natural sciences and build powerful bridges. There's no one better to learn how science and faith can support and inspire each other than Dr. Francis Collins, Director of the National Institutes of Health in the United States.
I want to talk to you, as was my assignment, about science and faith and the potential harmony between these worldviews. That's a bit of a different talk than I usually give. Right now, most of the talks I'm giving are about COVID-19, about diagnostics and therapeutics and vaccines. And goodness knows, we at NIH have been incredibly immersed in the effort to try to come up with answers to this terrible global pandemic. But today, with the request coming from Robin to speak a little differently, I'm going to be rather personal and talk about how this perspective as a person of science and a person of faith can in fact be complementary. Because I think that fits with the theme of this meeting, where we want to figure out how, from the perspective of both the most rigorous science, but also the deepest spiritual considerations, how we can really pay attention to the whole person, particularly when it comes to wellness and healing. Now, I got to tell you, as an atheist first-year medical student back in about 1973, the idea of such a presentation would have seemed like total nonsense to me. 5 years after that, however, it would have made perfect sense, and it makes perfect sense today. So what happened in those 5 years? Well, what happened to me, and I'll be a little personal here, is the experience as a medical student of sitting at the bedside of people who were approaching the end of their lives and for whom our medical interventions were clearly not going to provide a rescue. And recognizing that my own sense of immortality was also a fragile thing. And I wasn't sure how I would address the deep questions that they were asking and seeking answers for, like, is there a God? And does God care about me? And what's this all about anyway? I was already a scientist at that point. I got my PhD in physical chemistry, and I was very much of a mindset that anything worth knowing is something that you can discern through the tools of science. But in that experience of sitting at the bedside of dying people, I realized there were questions that science was powerless to respond to. Questions like, why is there something instead of nothing? What's the nature of good and evil? What happens after you die? Fascinating and important questions, but ones that science alone leaves us really without a path forward. And in that regard, to my dismay, I had to realize the scientific method is in a certain way impoverished if that's all you've got. Philosophers would say, although I didn't know the terms at the time, that my metaphysical naturalism was showing serious cracks. Scientists have to depend on studying nature using the tools of rationality and rigorous scientific approaches. You could call that methodological naturalism, and I use that in every day as I seek to try to understand how life works and how disease happens. But to say that's all there is, which is where I was as a first-year medical student, ultimately turned out to me to leave far too much territory unexplored that seemed profoundly important. I even began to recognize that there were pointers towards those kinds of profound questions coming from science that might have led one to imagine there is something beyond what we can measure that is worth thinking about and might even fit better with the notion of a creator. For instance, there is something instead of nothing. For instance, there was a beginning to the universe at the Big Bang. And how did that happen? Nature hasn't been observed to create itself out of nowhere. For instance, the fact that nature follows really elegant mathematical laws. Is there any reason why that should be? And even that those mathematical laws contain specific constants that just have the value they do. And if they were slightly off, this universe would have really no potential of anything interesting because you wouldn't be able to result in stars and galaxies and anything that could support any kind of life form that you could imagine. What's called the anthropic principle. Either that's a case where the dials were set, or you have to postulate an infinite set of other parallel universes that have different values of those constants, and we just happen to be in the one where it all worked. Well, which of those requires greater faith? I began to ask myself. And then going beyond that into the question of good and evil that had begun to trouble me as not having a good answer. Why is there such a concept? Evolution alone wouldn't necessarily lead you to the sense that we humans have had down through every culture, down through every millennia, that there is such a thing as good and evil. And we are called to do the good thing, even if it's sacrificial and it hurts our chances of reproduction. Where is that coming from? Have we been hoodwinked in some way to think that's real? Most people aren't ready to go there. I certainly was not. The moral law, as C.S. Lewis called it, and C.S. Lewis was a writer that I encountered as I began my own struggle to try to understand whether science and faith could coexist. C.S. Lewis, the Oxford scholar who traveled the same path from atheism to faith, became my guide and had seemed to anticipate a lot of my objections to anything that sounded a little outside of science, and was able to show me that most of those objections were, frankly, those of a schoolboy. They were not based upon deep introspection. Even the concept of beauty. I ask you all to think about that for a moment. Certainly the Vatican is a place where beauty is all around us. And yet, why does that matter? Why are we so moved by something like a beautiful sunset? Or why is it that when I hear a certain piece of music, like the second movement of Beethoven's Third Symphony, I am moved to tears? What is that about? That doesn't seem to have any evolutionary value, and yet it's powerful. And as John Polkinghorne, the physicist turned Anglican priest, who we've recently lost in the last few months, wrote, this just doesn't make sense. You can't dismiss beauty as nothing more than epiphenomenal froth on the surface of an uncaring universe. It seems much more powerful than that. Where is that coming from? Another glimmer, another signpost. So over the course of a couple of years, somewhat kicking and screaming, I moved from my atheistic first-year medical student perspective to becoming a believer, first in the idea of God and ultimately in a specific sense of God by coming to know the person of Jesus Christ. And I became a Christian and have been so for the last more than 40 years. And many would have said, okay, that's going to be a problem. You're going to have to compartmentalize those two worldviews, or they will come into conflict and generate some sort of an explosion in your brain. At best, you might be able to manage the Stephen Jay Gould version of non-overlapping magisteria, but I didn't know how to make them non-overlapping when they were both powerful parts of how I began to see truth. And instead, I became enamored and am to this day of the concept espoused by Sir Francis Bacon, who wrote about the two books that we have been given. In his view, God gave us the book of God's words, that being the Bible in my Christian faith, which I study almost daily. But he also gave us the book of God's works, which is nature. And we also have the opportunity to study that, which I do. And if they're both God's books, it doesn't make sense that they would somehow be in conflict with each other. And if we've imagined that there's such a conflict, we ought to think really hard about whether our interpretation has been misleading. And we maybe ought to reconsider what that particular text in that book said. And that for me has been completely comfortable now. Yes, there are certain readings of certain parts of the biblical text, like the first couple of books of the Bible, and particularly Genesis 1 and 2, that if read in a certain way, which Americans somehow in the last 150 years have particularly embraced, namely an ultra-literal interpretation of texts, which many scholars would say were never intended to be seen that way, might be very incompatible with our recognition that the universe is very old, 14 billion roughly years, and the Earth itself is 4.5 billion years old. You can't get to a 7-day literal creation from science, but there are lots of ways that you can put these kinds of things together that are utterly harmonious, including evolution. If God chose to use the process of evolution to create ultimately over long periods of time big-brained creatures that would have a sense of self-knowledge, of consciousness, of recognition of good, of evil, and of a hunger to reach out and discover the Creator. Who are we to say that's not the way we would have done it? Well, maybe we wouldn't have, but it is elegant, it is beautiful, and it's created this marvelous complexity all around us. So I don't see conflict. If you're going to ask me a scientific question or suggest a scientific conclusion, I'm going to expect rigor in every way, in the way in which you approach it. But if it's something beyond that, where science basically doesn't have an opportunity to provide much of an answer, and faith does, then I'm going to be really glad to embrace that too. Because you see, science is really good at asking questions that start with the word how. How does this work? Faith is pretty good at answering questions, many of them, that start with the word why. Why am I here? Why is there something instead of nothing? Again, science doesn't help you with a lot of those. So if you want to ask all the questions, then it seems to me you want to have both science and faith as your ways of approaching those questions. If you want to see what people are thinking and talking about in this space of the possible complementarity of science and faith, there's actually a lot going on. The people who promote conflict got most of the attention until recently, but if you go to the website called Biologos, Biologos, you'll see a wonderfully rich discussion in very loving civil ways amongst people who are both interested in science and interested in faith and trying to understand how those can in fact speak to each other. Biologos Foundation is one that I started 12 years ago and then had to walk away from in order to become the director of NIH, but it has flourished, probably better so without me, and is a wonderful meeting place if you want to see what people are thinking about and writing about in this space. And it's quite a community. So we are spiritual creatures. And we're here at this meeting to talk about mind, body, and soul and how that plays out in health. I would argue wellness and healing work best when our spiritual nature is also considered. And to disregard that limits the potential we may have to assist individuals to live out a life that is as healthy as possible, to have a health span that is as maximally beneficial to them as it can be. Just to finish, of course, we speak at a time where wellness and health have been under great threat to our whole planet because of COVID-19. It is also, one might point to, both a medical and a spiritual crisis. The medical ones being most obvious in terms of the lives that have been lost, the suffering that has occurred, so many ways in which this coronavirus has disrupted what people assumed were going to be a smoother time in the area of health. But it has also disrupted us spiritually. It has caused great amounts of struggle in terms of mental health, anxiety, depression, even a sense of PTSD from people who have gone through this over and over again. The hope that we might want to offer now comes in many ways from science, and it's something that I'm immersed in every day. The development of these vaccines coming forward at extraordinary speed with unexpectedly, remarkably high efficacy and safety. An answer to prayer, one might even say. But also the other struggles that people are having, which vaccines alone are not going to deal with. The sense of hopelessness that many have experienced, of fear. That is where I think faith is a much better solution, perhaps, than many have given it credit for. For me, I've had my own times over these 15 months of feeling frustrated, maybe even a little hopeless that this virus continued to win the battles that we were losing, and could not help but ask God, why is this happening? Is there not something that you can do about it? But as I read through the pages of that book of God's words, of the Bible, I found myself settling into the Psalms a lot. Because if you think that our times of struggle are novel, well, go and read the Psalms and you'll see what David and the other writers of those hymns were dealing with also. And I continually come back to them, and particularly to Psalms like Psalm 46, which seems to have been written for this era. Psalm 46 begins, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Trouble. We've had trouble. We're still having trouble. But this is this promise that God is aware of that and with us and is a refuge and a strength. So I'm glad for the vaccines. I'm glad for the remarkable advances in diagnostic technologies to figure out where this virus is and who's been infected. And I'm glad for the therapeutic advances that are happening. But I'm also glad that I have this promise of a God who understands suffering, died on a cross in a suffering experience that none of us can even imagine, and who is our refuge and strength and our ever-present help in trouble. And as we seek in the course of this conference to understand how we can best bring together all of the skills and tools that we have to help people who need that kind of help, let us keep in mind that science and faith can do that together better than they can separately. Thank you all very much for listening. My regrets that we can't have a lovely conversation after this about the thoughts that you may have, because I'm sure you have many. And I will look forward to the day when we may all do that together in a beautiful surrounding and see whether in the process we can learn from each other. Many thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Robin Smith and Dr. Collins. For our next plenary panel presentation, I'm very pleased to offer to the summit audience the Japan Symposium, an event that we've run about 6 years now as part of the World Stem Cell Summit. This year, the Japan Symposium is presented by the Japanese Society for Regenerative Medicine, the largest regenerative medicine society on the planet. The last time I counted, they had something like 6,000 members. It's an enormous, enormous group of dedicated professionals, all dedicated to advancing our field. Japan, of course, is a leader in stem cell research and regenerative medicine. Dr. Shinya Yamanaka was awarded the Nobel Prize for his work on reprogrammed cells and iPSCs. Japan is working, unlike almost any other country, working together to accelerate the field. That means government, industry, and academic institutions. And today, this session will present some of the best that is coming out of Japan. We'll start with an animated video that I found incredibly interesting, and I hope you do as well. And then an array of researchers and industry leaders to explain some of the advancements of science. To understand our field and to understand the context of where the world is, one must understand how Japan is leading the way.